Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us on the Developmental Performance online workshop series. We're really lucky to have a fantastic guest with us today, Maximilian Lankheit from the Seattle Sounders. For those of you who haven't participated in the Developmental Performance online workshop series, today we have a live presentation from Max, and then following that we'll have an interactive Q&A. So we encourage you, if you have any questions throughout his presentation, feel free to post them in the chat. And once he's finished his presentation, we'll be able to ask Max any of those questions and give us a great insight into what he's presenting today. With the Developmental Performance platform, we're really looking to facilitate creative discussions and challenge the theories and the concepts that we're applying in current sports performance and sports medicine. So we really do encourage you to ask any questions of either Max or myself following the presentation. This is the first of presentations for our leadership series, which is going to be running over the next week on the Developmental Performance platform. Today, as mentioned, we have Max's topic on diversity, how great teams thrive in a complex world. And next week, we have some great concepts around the fundamentals of high performance culture, dealing with stress, and then a live roundtable next Wednesday afternoon with some leadership consultants and high performance team from Ulster Rugby, which will be really engaging. As I mentioned, we're fortunate enough to have Max today. He's the head of developmental performance for the Seattle Sounders. Prior to this role, he has worked across Major League Baseball and football. Today, he's going to share with us his insights into one of the important components of developing collaborative teams and sustained success as an organisation. Really looking forward to this chat, and thanks for having us, Max. I'll just stop sharing my screen and let you go. All yours when you're ready.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Hello, welcome. Anybody around the globe. I don't know from where you are right now, but obviously it's the middle of the day at the Pacific Northwest. I'm going to start sharing my screen here and going to go back. So thanks again for having me. Also, thanks to Aaron and Sam and everyone else at Developmental Performance who's involved in setting up this series. So far, there wasn't a single one that I wasn't able to learn from and reflect on. So I hope I can follow these footsteps on a very controversial topic that I'm very passionate about, let me put it that way. And why this topic is so important for me is, as you can see, I've worked around the world, or I lived around the world a fair bit, but this doesn't look that impressive yet. But if I show you with how many nationalities I worked with in my career, then that draws a little bit different picture here, right? So it just goes to show that we're exposed to diversity and a diversity of thinking, a diversity of culture anywhere. However, disclaimer is obviously this more reflects the identity diversity, which is not necessarily the topic of today. I just want to make that clear that we're not talking so much about cultural differences today, more about actually what it means that we are thinking differently, right? So full transparency, this is not going to be part of this presentation. However, it just goes to show 6 different languages, 5 different countries, 4 different sports, and 36 different nationalities I've worked with. And if you don't need me as an example, you can also just look at the starting 11 of the 2019 Champions League final, 7 different nationalities in the starting 11 of Liverpool, right? Which also means, if you think about that there's still a fair core group of English players in that squad, right? So it's about 35% were still English in that squad. Anyhow, once again, identity diversity, not so much the topic of today, but important as a context. So this is what we're going to talk about today. I have you have a little quick look on that. So my hope is essentially that after this webinar, all of you appreciate how diversity contributes to better decisions, a better workplace, and for everyone to appreciate the individual blind spots and welcome a difference of opinions as an opportunity to grow and as an incubus for new ideas and innovation. And I will promise you one thing, that this talk will be about objective benefits of diversity and not some wishy-washy type of touchy-feely thing that I think might be worth the time. No, this is all very science-based and study-based. So let's dive right in with a tale of fish and man. And if you think that I'm going to recite the joke with the old fish that's meeting those two young fish in the water, you're wrong. You can read that up yourself on Google. I will actually talk about a study where they put a huge fish tank in the center of the room with a beautiful fish. And then they had a group of Americans have a look at it. And a few minutes later, they had a group of Japanese look at the very same fish tank. And what they found was very interesting because the Americans looked at the fish. So they looked at all the details of the fish. Whilst the Japanese as a group, they actually looked at everything but the fish. They looked at the structure of the water. They looked at the everything else that was going on, right? So this sparked some more interest of those researchers. So they took this a little bit further. So what they did then is they put the fish in different fish tanks, right? So what they then found was the Japanese didn't realize that all the fish were actually the same, while the Americans didn't realize that it was different fish tanks. So who's right or wrong? No one, obviously, because it just goes to show that people perceive the world in different ways, right? We would call that frame of reference or mental models. And what I want you to understand or take away from this very first example is no one model is right or wrong. Each model simply has blind spots, and only combined, they build the full picture. So and after this very first example, I can already tell I know you, because there's only three types of people now. Either the believers, the deniers, or the don't carers. Funny thing is, all of you are wrong, because it's not a magic bullet. No one single person can ever solely be responsible for a team success, and it's also not a waste of time. But I understand there's a lot of scientists out there, so I go with the mantra of Edward Denning: in God we trust, all others must bring data, and I will bring some data to you. But first of all, let's look at the problems in high performance sport. So what type of problems are there actually, and what type of problems are we facing? So there's a rather simple problem, right? A simple problem is essentially following a recipe. It's a simple causation leading to predictable results. Diversity is not necessary. Let's take a sporting example. Let's take the 100-meter relay race at the Olympics. If you have 4 Usain Bolts, guess what? You're going to win, because the whole is simply the sum of each individual's performance. So if this is not what we're facing, maybe we're facing complicated problems, right? And complicated problems, they have parts, but they are joined. However, in relatively simple ways. So if you get all the multiple steps right, you can actually calculate the results. A complicated problem is, for example, sending a rocket to the moon, right? Also, I think diversity is not necessary, because the most talented or intelligent person, for that matter, will be able to solve that problem. But also, we're not facing this type of problem on a daily basis in high performance sport. We're facing potentially these types of problems, so-called complex problems, right? So they're too complex for one individual to be solved. And complex occurs when the number of interactions and interdependencies increase dramatically. And more often than not, it's actually first and foremost about finding out what the problem actually is. So which comes down to the old hammer and nail analogy, I guess. Only because you have a hammer doesn't mean it's the right tool for the right task, right? So I think if we look at this and if we agree on that this is the type of problems we are facing predominantly in high performance sport, then cognitive diversity does have a benefit, or many benefits actually. And that's scientifically proven. I'm going to start with this. Functional diversity is the single most consistent positive contributor for group organizational performance. However, to which extent your team organization can reap these diversity bonuses, as I call them, is highly dependent on its leadership. And for that, leadership needs to model the necessary behavior and attitude towards difference, shape the environment accordingly, provide effective management, and last but not least, support diversity efforts across all areas and departments. And I don't know if you saw our sports science conference yesterday, but Joyce was making a very good point. All of this even doesn't matter if you don't have a common goal. If you don't have that one North Star that everybody can relate to and everybody's working towards to, anything else does not matter. Because only if everybody knows what the common goal is, this will lead to respect, acceptance, and the value of diversity of opinions. Because otherwise we will get those interpersonal conflicts, that lack of trust and this bad communication, right? So if we can agree on that this is the framework of everything, now we can look into the actual different models of diversity or cognitive diversity, right? And the first model is called the toolbox model. And it essentially looks at the skills and talents, ideas, knowledge, whatever, as a collection of tools of an individual, right? So if we have 3 people and all of them have a different set of tools, right? And I think it's fairly simple to say, if they all have the same tools, we have 0% diversity. But if they would all have unique tools, we get 100% diversity. So if we have that in mind, then we can say or conclude that the first added bonus becomes every unique tool. And the second added bonus is every possible combination of each tool. So A, B, A, C, D, E, and so on and so forth, right? Once again, no complexity is factored into this, right? So I have to look at this from a linear perspective. I'm not going to put communication, mood, hierarchy in this equation because obviously the human is a very complex system by itself. So this is just a model, right? However, even this is a little bit flawed because it looks at this under the assumption that all the tools are in a hierarchical order, which means A is more important than B, and so on. But is that what we're facing in real life? Most certainly not, because real life works in neural networks. Sometimes A is more important than B, correct. But sometimes C is more important than A, or E can be more important than A and B together, right? So a good real life example would be training load management. It's not an external load problem. It's physiology, it's psychology, it's genetics, and so on and so forth. So we have to look at even the toolbox model from a more perspective of neural networks, which would look like this. However, still, the hypothesis is if a single person possesses all the tools out there, she could solve all the problems. Because if you have all the tools, you don't need somebody else to combine them. You can do that by yourself. So if this is not the model we're facing, because we know that nobody is the one omnipotent person on this planet, we need to look at a different model. And that's the portfolio model. And that looks at the abilities of each individual like a fund manager looks at the portfolio, right? So the manager buys different funds, bonds, stocks, et cetera, to minimize your risk of losing money. I mean, I hope he does. And that's how it looks like, right? So let's say person A has a bonus of 3, person C 5, but person D for a specific task actually is very counterproductive, right? So if we think about this now, we can say that the average of ideas equals the number 3. You don't get any diversity bonus because person C is still smarter than the average. Same goes if we think like, oh, the best idea, again, is 5. There's also no diversity bonus because, again, person number C could do easily without anybody else. But only if we share those ideas, we get the diversity bonus. And here I want you to realize something. The negative ideas don't matter. It's just 3 plus 5 plus 1 that equal the 9. Because the other 2, in a linear fashion or from a linear perspective, wouldn't chime into the discussion, right? Also on that note, I'm not going to factor in things like decision-making speed, individual long-term memory, communication flaws, and so on, right? So now, if we agree on that this is the model we're looking at, or this is the model where diversity actually makes sense, right? then we can explain this with the very first case study of today, which is the Netflix price. And I don't know how many of you followed that back in 2006 or actually up until 2009, but it was a competition announced in 2006 and the contest rules were as follows. And I'm going to read this to you. The first contestant that could improve Netflix's own algorithm, Cinematch, by 10% would be awarded $1 million US. Cinematch, for those who don't know, was predicting movie watchers' ratings. So 5 stars, 4 stars, and so on and so forth. And in order to accomplish this, all of those contestants had to master 2 tasks, right? First task was finding out which features are most relevant, informative, and tractable. So for example, age, genre, actors, and so on and so forth. And the other task was to come up with an algorithm to make predictions, right? And I'm not going to go into details here, but if you think that's fairly easy, the more features I can find out there are, the more accurate my model gets. That's wrong. The data scientists can back me up on this, because you can easily overfit any model out there. So the participants were talented and skilled individuals and groups of friends who were able to improve that algorithm by 6 to 8% within the very first year after the contest was launched. But then nothing happened for another year. Netflix even thought people gave up. But in 2008, something very interesting happened. A team with the name Belcore, which was a team of students from the US East Coast, they partnered up with a team called Big Chaos out from Austria. And Belcore was smart. Why did they choose that team from Austria? Well, they were certain that they had the best prediction algorithms out there, but they realized they would never reach the capacity of Big Chaos's ability to combine predictions. So this newly formed team got closer to the 10% mark, but they still weren't able to pass it. So they looked for a different partner on how to improve their outcome then. And this time their wise choice fell on the Canadian team, Pragmatic Theory, who looked at the whole contest from a very different angle than anybody else, which was human behavior. Give you an example. I would rate a movie differently if I watch it by myself than I would go and watch it with a date. Or funny movies usually get rated when the credits are showing, whilst sad movies are apparently usually rated on a Monday. Don't ask me why, but apparently it's true. So this new team, Belcore's Pragmatic Chaos, was finally able to pass those 10%, nearly 3 years later after the competition was originally announced. And there's a website out there which is called How the Netflix Prize Was Won. And the editor of that prize summed the entire contest up in this sentence here. The secret sauce was collaboration between the diverse ideas and not in some touchy-feely, unquantifiable way. They beat the challenge by combining teams and their algorithms into more complex ones, incorporating everybody's work. Right? And that's a key takeaway here. Right? It's by combining different ideas. Belcore was smart, like I said. They knew more of the same is not getting better. We need something else to jump over the hurdle. And then together, they also thought the other thing, right? So now that we know that this model actually works, let's look at what actually makes up cognitive diversity, right? First and foremost, we have informations, which are represented by facts. Then we have knowledge, which is the practical understanding of those facts. Then we have tools, which equals skills. We have representations, which is a way of thinking. We have those mental models I described at the very beginning. And we've got heuristics. And that's the methods of finding solutions. So in best case, a group has access to everybody's individual components. And now, let me give you a first task for today. And I call it defeating cancer. So imagine you're a doctor and you knew that this very cute girlie has a brain tumor. And if the tumor doesn't get destroyed, she would die. However, you have a fantastic equipment and you know that with your radiation technology, the tumor can be destroyed and you can save the girl. but only if the rays would hit the tumor all at once. The problem is, though, that the radiation of those rays is so strong, it would destroy all the tissue it hits as well. And the girl would die from that, right? But again, lower radiation wouldn't destroy the tumor either. So what do you do? Don't worry, if you didn't get the solution, you're amongst a very good company, because 75% of the people don't know the solution to that problem, right? So they still have a huge question mark. But what if I told you a story now about a tower where a dictator kept all his political prisoners? The tower was surrounded by a village where all the streets were leading straight to that tower. Looks a little bit like this. However, all those streets were full with mines that go off when a certain amount of men walk over that street at the same time. No nation was therefore able to rescue their people because they didn't manage to walk up to that tower with enough men at the same time to conquer it. Until one general came along, and he coordinated his troops into small teams. Each of those teams took a separate street at individual times of the day, so they could reach the tower simultaneously. The tower was conquered, the prisoners were freed, and the general, hey, guess what? He was a hero. So now solve the problem again. Most likely we were able to solve it, right? I'm not gonna tell you what the answer is. You can ask in the Q&A if you didn't find it out, or I'll give you a little bit more time, right? But why was it so simple for those of you that actually were able to get the solution now? It's very simple, because you had a different experience that you could draw from. And it wasn't even a medical story. So what I'm trying to say here is that teams will always perform better than an individual, because they can draw from a larger pool of those cognitive components. More ideas, more info, more knowledge, and more different ways of thinking, right? But if we know what the cognitive components are, is only one part of the story, because we need to know when to use those cognitive components. In order to know when to use what, we also need to know for what we use them. And that's what we call characterizations. And characterizations are essentially the tasks we use those components for. And these are the tasks we're facing in our day-to-day business. We need to predict things. We need to innovate, solve problems, obviously. We need to integrate knowledge. And we need to create at the very end as well, right? So if we know now what the components are and what the tasks are that we can use them for, now it comes down to how do we know what to use when, right? So that was kind of like what Dave Tenney was alluding to yesterday. He almost had too many people out there with diverse thinking. So instead of potentially hiring the people for the specific task relevant things he had on his mind, right? And that's just an assumption from me. So not to say that he didn't think about that. However, if you look at predicting things, what we need essentially is information, categorization, and different models. And those all work together via negative correlation. For innovating tasks, we need representations because they create more possibilities. For problem solving, we need different heuristics that build off of one another. And for integrating knowledge, well, guess what? We need more knowledge. And that works because the more we know, the more we can actually say what's true or not, because it actually reduces the possibilities in what's true and what's not. And last but not least, for strategic thinking and decision making, we need representations, heuristic, and models. Okay, because less correlations in mistakes will happen. So now we have a whole picture of when to use what are components, and now we can dive into our next case study, which is now about predicting things, okay? So there was a study where they took 60 random financial forecasters and took some other random funds and whatnot and said like, hey, you guys, please predict the value of those financial investments over the next few months and years. So, and the best forecaster was actually 5% better than the average of everybody else. So if I would ask you now, hey, would you, give this person your money to invest for you? I'd say 5%, that's, decent. Maybe yes. But now the guys thought, hey, what if we actually combine the best forecasters together? And this is what they found. The average of the best forecasters, so the 6 best ones, was actually 25% better than the average of all forecasters. And 15% better than the best forecaster himself. In this case, it was a he. And I realized that these results are highly counterintuitive. But in my next slides, I will explain to you and I will prove to you why this is in fact always true. Right? So let's look into this. Let's quantify diversity bonuses. And as often in science, it works with building a hypothesis. Right? And the hypothesis is that ability and diversity contribute equally to the collective ability. And since we're talking about a predictive task, right? I think we all can agree that ability essentially equals accuracy. The more accurate I am in my prediction, the better I am, right? So that means that the error equals the prediction minus the true value. And I have to square it to come to always positive numbers, right? So if we have 2 people now that make a prediction, then this person here predicts 10%, the true value is 7%, so he has an error of 9%. The other individual predicts 2%, again, the true value is 7%, so he or she comes down to 25%. The average error, therefore, is 17%. The average prediction equals 6%. Once again, 10 plus 2% divided by 2, because it's 2 people, gives me the 6%. The collective error, therefore, is the average prediction minus, again, the true value. So it's 1%. So if you look at the numbers, the error of the first person, 10%, and the error of the second person, 2%, actually the collective error is lower than both. So that leads to the conclusion that the crowd makes a better prediction than its average member. But hold on, that's only one part of the equation, right? So now we spoke about ability, but what's with the actual part or with the actual topic of this presentation, diversity? Well, we state, or the hypothesis, that it's equally important, right? So let's say the predictive diversity is the variations in predictions or abilities for that matter, right? So which means the variation is prediction of person A minus the average group prediction of the second person, and so on and so forth. We only have 2 people, so we only divide this by 2, right? Which gives us 16%. The collective error, once again, is the average error minus the predictive diversity, because if it's evenly or equally important, then it must be the same. So that becomes 1% as well. And for those who have a very good short-term memory, I guess I don't need to scroll back, but it's the same 1% as before, right? For those who don't, there you go. Collective error was also 1% without diversity. And here it's the same without ability, which means that group's ability, it's proven that the average ability plus diversity equals that. Shocker, I know. However, more diversity is not always better, right? So there's a quick, obviously, note. Exceptions apply to the rule as always. And I will explain to you how that works. So let's say there is a performance department, there's 2 people, and those 2 correctly predict that the sum of a player's missed training days in this week will be 0. But then the PR director predicts 6 missed training days. Obviously, it has nothing to do with the performance department, but he thought he's going to chime in and give his prediction. So we get an average prediction then of 2, right? The collective error, therefore, becomes 4. The predictive error by the PR director himself is 36. The average error equals 12. Diversity equals 8. If we look at the performance department only, those 2 people, right, then we will get to an equation of 0 equals 0 minus 0. But if we have the performance director, the PR director in the same boat, all of a sudden it becomes a 4. So what I'm trying to say here is, at an inaccurate prediction, it not necessarily makes it more accurate. Because if everyone has it right and all errors equal 0, a bad prediction will obviously increase the error. So let's sum this up. Proof number 1 was a diverse group will always be more accurate than the average of its members. Proof number 2 was there's no trade-off between diversity and ability. Both equaled 1%, if you remember. Proof number 3, is a group's ability equals its average ability plus diversity. Proof number 4 was adding a more accurate or a more diverse predictor makes a group more accurate. Doesn't matter which one. And number 5, obviously, I'm not smart enough to having been able to come up with this myself. Actually, this is the original so-called diversity prediction theorem equation here. And if you want to learn more about that, I highly recommend to look into the work of Scott E. Page from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, right? He's just fantastic. Let me just tell you this. It's worth to look into anything he does. Now that we spoke about prediction tasks, now let's talk about innovation, right? To stay ahead of the curve in a high performance sport environment, it's always important to innovate things, to think about new ways of looking at things and so on and so forth, right? And that's why I call it the collective brain. A few of you guys already see, hey, the left-hand side, that's definitely Neanderthal. And the right-hand side, that's Homo sapiens, which we obviously originate from. The funny thing is, the Neanderthals had bigger brains. So how come, if they had bigger brains, that it was actually us that evolved and survived and not those guys? So they took a study, and I call them geniuses now, right? Because of the bigger brains. So if they're the genius Neanderthals, and they had an idea every 10 lifetimes, but they also only had one friend, and they had a learning rate of 50%. Let's call us the networkers. We are much more stupid. We only had an idea every 1,000 lifetimes, but we like to mingle, we like to stay in groups, we like to talk, we like to walk together. So we had 10 friends. Same learning rate applies. So where will the innovation be more common? Obviously, it's a trick question, and you get the idea. So the innovation is actually 18% in 18% of the population of the Neanderthals, so of the geniuses, right? However, it's actually 99.9% of the population of the networkers. And even more impressive is the fact that 50% of those 18% actually learned it themselves, as opposed to 0.1% in the networking community. So what I'm trying to say here, ideas always inspire new ones. So places that facilitate idea sharing tend to become more productive and innovative than those that don't, right? And the reason is when ideas are shared, the possibilities don't actually add up, they multiply. So if you want to innovate, it's better to be social than smart. Which brings me to the last case study of today, which I call change is going to come. So again, it's a little bit of what Dave Tenney described yesterday in our sports science seminar. And what you see here is, it's funny that it's also an NBA example. What you see here is in 1979, the NBA introduced the three-pointer, right? But in the very first season, all the teams averaged only 3 three-pointers per game. Whilst in the 2017-18 season, as you can see on the right-hand side in the left graph, 29 per game on average. To give a more vivid number here, the 81-82 champion, the Los Angeles Lakers, scored a total of 13 three-pointers in the entire season, right? In their defense, they only tried it 94 times. However, if you look at Steve Curry himself, or just by himself in 18-19, he tried it over 350 times with a 44% accuracy. That's 12 per game and scoring 5 of those, just as a little bit of a point of reference. The little spike in the middle here in the 90s was because they moved the three-point line a little closer to the basket, right? So which is why there's a little bit higher accuracy there. If you've seen the documentary about Michael Jordan and the Bulls, there's another great example about the triangle offense, right? Horace Grant said, I don't know if it's episode 3 or 4 this Sunday, but he said it took us 4 years to master this triangle offense. So what I'm trying to say is, don't give up too easily, right? And always put into context that, like, where we're coming from, right? And we're all coming from segregated societies and a history of exclusion, right? And even worse, like in the past few years, I'm not going to try to make this political, but in the past few years, we're going in the direction again. Instead of being inclusive, nations are actually separating themselves again and trying to practice exclusion. And as you learned right before, that doesn't help anybody to progress into anything. So what I'm wanting you to take away from this slide is, don't give up easy. Diversity just takes practice. You can't expect something to happen on day one. If you have a whole group of new people coming in pre-season, they need to get to know each other. And that's when the human component obviously also comes in, right? You may have the right people. You may have the right people. Just give them time to see how to communicate and how to work together and how to know when, what needs to be done and of whom and so on and so forth, right? So these underlying constructs, can be explained a little bit better by systems thinking or models of group dynamic, which is a whole different topic by itself, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea here. Yeah, so to sum everything up now, if we think about this as at the rectangle, as anything that's out there to know, or a task or a problem that needs to be solved, we can say that this one person here is a rather intelligent person, right? However, one person can only know so much. So always hire the person who can add the most new ideas and novel tools. The second option is a rather unintelligent team of clones, right? So you can have more of the same is not better, because you have to change the underlying way of thought, because otherwise the pattern will repeat itself over and over again. Because what you get is this collective blindness. What you want is this, obviously. That's an intelligent team. And now I know what you're saying, kind of like, hey, we're facing very, very tough times right now. I don't have money to get new people on board that might increase the diversity, or B, I also don't want to fire people because I really like them. There's another way of creating diversity here, right? So diversity can already be created by changing organizational and/or operational structures. Because what you do is you break down fundamental barriers between silos. So more innovative, efficient, effective solutions can be developed by that already, right? So this by itself will lead to functionally diverse teams that can create collaboration and interdependence. And a very good book on this is actually One Mission by Chris Fussell. And he was one of the army guys that served under General McChrystal, who wrote this rather famous book, Team of Teams. So he explains it from a perspective of actually kind of like an employee, if you will. So I really highly recommend that book rather than actually the Team of Teams book. So what you get here is the wisdom of the crowd. And I guess some of you may have heard this already, this phrase, right? So to create effective, diverse teams, you need to apply logic, data, and experience. And there's one other, obviously, component, which is if you have a diverse but task irrelevant team. So only hiring a person because he or she is different can obviously be counterproductive, as my example with the PR director showed, right? Even in theory, that's already wrong, because it becomes even more difficult when putting the human component into consideration as well, right? So what you need to have is a very clear understanding what your mission and your goals are, as well as knowing what exact cognitive components you're looking for and which characterizations you want to accomplish or solve, whichever word you prefer, right? So if a group can reap diversity benefits depends on the task. And ultimately, you can have a diverse team, and that's potentially what a lot of us are facing or have faced or had been facing in the past, but you can have a very dominance or power-driven leader, right? That breaks everything down, but because at the end of the day, either everybody is tending towards this opinion of this one individual, or this person doesn't even care what the other people have to say and gives you kind of like this autocratic leadership style, right? So studies of organizational psychology found that if everyone knows what the guiding North Star is, this will automatically increase the respect for diversity of this specific leader, even if it's an autocratic leader, right? He will subjectively value diversity more. However, if you're facing this right now, what you can do is essentially, you can either silence the leader, which means just let him speak last in every meeting you have. So just make sure that he or she is the person who gives everybody else the chance to say something first, and prevent this social loafing, which is when everybody kind of like chimes into the same opinion, because they don't feel psychologically safe enough to actually voice what they have to say, right? A good way to solve this social loafing actually is something that's called brain writing instead of brainstorming. So instead of everybody just saying what they think, they let everybody write down what their opinion is or what their solution may be. So the best idea wins because nobody knows who actually wrote it down, right? And then ultimately, there's my one slide summary. These are the 5 rules of diversity. If you only take one thing away, it may be this. Rule number 1 is diversity cannot be arbitrary or random. I think I explained that with the task irrelevant team, right? Rule number 2, it works when diverse groups work together on non-routine cognitive complex tasks. For a simple problem, you don't need diversity. You just need the best. Rule number 3 would be diverse groups function effectively in a highly charged, competitive, fast changing world. Because that's when these things are sparked the most. Rule number 4 would be problems are too complex to be solved by one individual. And the last rule here, the highest ability group consists of people with different information, diverse categories, and a variety of context relevant models. And once again, if you don't believe me, there's my last slide of the day. And oh, there it is.
George, you know, that woman just looked at you.
So what? What am I supposed to do?
Go talk to her.
Elaine, bald men with no jobs and no money who live with their parents don't approach strange women.
Well, here's your chance to try the opposite. Instead of tuna salad and being intimidated by women, chicken salad and going right up to them.
Yeah, I should do the opposite. I should.
If every instinct you have is wrong, then the opposite would have to be right.
Yes, I will do the opposite. I used to sit here and do nothing and regret it for the rest of the day. So now I will do the opposite and I will do something. Excuse me, I couldn't help but notice that you were looking in my direction.
Oh, yes, I was. You just ordered the same exact lunch as me.
My name is George. I'm unemployed and I live with my parents.
I'm Victoria. Hi.
So the key takeaway of today is just always believe that the opposite leads to the best results. These are the resources, and if you want to get in touch with me, you can either reach me over those social media lines, or you can visit the IWSPF website, where I have a lecture series on leadership as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. That was fantastic. What better way to finish a presentation with a good Seinfeld reference? So
Always.
Thank you very much for that. Very informative and some great content. I think really enjoyed how you combined some of the research with the practical applications, and probably with your last clip in regards to the Seinfeld component. We've all been probably in an environment where maybe we have wanted to speak up, and maybe that, as you spoke about, that psychological safety isn't there to possibly challenge. If we are support staff and we have that leader that you spoke about that maybe doesn't value kind of the diverse thinking or challenging, how do we go about working within those environments? If they are the leader and you can't silence them, what's the best strategies to employ to challenge that or to engage in diverse thinking?
Well, I think the first rule should always be, listen to understand, instead of trying to convince somebody from something or of something, because obviously, I think what I was trying to explain as well, everybody has their way of perceiving the world, right? So even that leader, like, he's behaving in a certain way because that's just how he was kind of like, how he was taught, or life taught him to react, right? So not to say that makes any difference, but it helps at least to understand where he or she may be coming from, right? And then just trying to find out, okay, I think what worked for me or what didn't work for me in the past, so I learned the hard way, is kind of like, instead of then telling them that this is, that my solution is the best solution, like asking them, okay, what is it that you want from me? And how do you think that should look like? Because I think oftentimes in those types of conversations you have with such a leader is also like, they're not even sure, which is why potentially they're reacting in a certain way or acting in a certain way, because it's their uncertainty that they're facing someone who might actually know more about something than they do. So they're more kind of like on the road of, I need to still, it's like this, why is a dog barking? Oftentimes it's not they're barking because they're angry, it's because they're afraid, right? And I think this is something that should be our first thought process, that, hey, I'm here to help, and not trying to, I'm here to tell. That makes sense? I don't know if that answers the question well enough.
Yeah, no, definitely. It probably touches a little bit on some of Brene Brown's work in regards to the vulnerability component and I guess different leadership qualities that may interact with some of the work that you presented today. You spoke briefly around the blind spots and the biases component. Do you have strategies that allow you to best help people identify what their blind spots and biases are? Or is that a component of having good cognitive diversity, is that it assists people to identify their own biases?
Very good question. I think it's I had a slide in there with like 10 assumptions. I think that's one of the assumptions you always have to have in your head, that whatever somebody says, they have, they filter it because they like regarding the fact who they're talking to, right? And so I do think it's always, again, it comes down to the same thing. I don't know if you can tell somebody what the blind spot is without giving them a frame of reference. So I think what works is always giving your own, like telling them your own vulnerability. Again, Brené Brown was a great example of you. Like if you tell them what doesn't work for you and where you did something wrong, what you didn't see, potentially like with a frame of reference then, what you think their bias is, and just taking you as then the example of that story, make yourself the hero of that story, then I think that helps them to see them, like putting a mirror in front of them without actually doing it. That makes sense in regards of the bias. And otherwise, I do believe it comes down to this organizational culture. Then again, if everybody knows that it's safe to not know, then I think by itself, people understand that then in a perfect world, somebody else could tell you, listen, I do think what you're trying to do here does not lead to the result you want. Without that person then being kind of like hurt or being angry and so on and so forth, or getting emotional about it. I made that mistake myself, and more often than not, to be honest, and I still make it, unfortunately, but I wish I was better at that. But I remember working with a certain PT in the past, and I just couldn't understand why the person didn't see, what was right in front of him in that case. So I was like a little baby and like, getting really mad. But on the other hand, I was the problem, to be honest, because I should have gone like, hey, if I can't show the person why potentially what I think is better, he doesn't have any chance to actually also tell me why he thinks that's better, because he just goes in total defense mode as well. So it's kind of like, I don't know.
It sounds like you've been able to be self-aware and self-reflect, which is one of the most important components about learning from your experiences and your failures and successes to then hopefully move forward and be able to then be present in that same scenario again in the future, but not have the same negative impact or not go down the same path. So yeah, that's an important component. You touched on the organizational culture. If we are trying to use some of the concepts that you spoke about today, but the culture is poor within our organization, how do you start as a manager or as an employee to actually change that to help create a successful culture and a more diverse team?
Yeah, I think you use the right word here. I think that's then potentially more a management thing at that moment in time, because as a leader, you should always obviously model behavior and model like the values and of that specific organization. But on the other hand, if you have those different functional subgroups or sub-teams, as in, let's say, performance department, manual department, and so on and so forth, then I think, and you are not in charge of the bigger picture, I think what it comes down to in that case is, at least within your core group, have a clear mission yourself, right? So these are the things, like, I can go down from the pyramid. So if it comes down to setting OKRs, so objectives and key results, right? Which means if the CEO's goal is to win the league title, like that for the head, that's his objective, right? And his key result is, scoring more goals than the opponent in the final. And what does that mean for the next person in line, which is the head coach? It means, hey, I need to win 35 out of whatever, 45 games, right? And so on. So you can then see, like, if I have those layered objectives and mark them, what is the result to actually achieve those objectives, then anybody in the organization can see how this, like my individual one potentially, is actually helping the other person to achieve their goal, if that makes sense. And that way you can create this kind of like supportive environment, because then my boss all of a sudden realizes, okay, I need to support him because he supports me in achieving mine, and the other way around. And if I don't help him, I can help my boss, so I look bad too. So I think having those set OKRs and being very transparent about them and sharing them openly throughout the entire organization, so everybody always knows what they are for each individual and each subgroup, and then having those key results, as in, you know, I had one with my team, for example. We implemented a new software, and I said, like, hey, how can, the objective was to maximize its use for wellness questionnaires, right? So that's the objective. And the result was, I want to achieve 85% of compliance within a certain time frame, right? And that way, like, it's measurable. And it's a time frame, and everybody knows, hey, I can then grade the individual, go like, hey, it was your responsibility to increase this to 85%, and so on and so forth, right? So I think one thing is setting those objectives, but the other thing is then actually kind of like trying to actually grade them. And I think this is the management component, but that will help now to make the whole turn again. That will help them to create this culture where everybody's supporting each other without actually talking about culture. If that makes sense.
Perfect. No, great example. Great example. We have a question just from Ross in regards to the author of one of the books you mentioned. I think it was called One Mission.
Yeah.
What was the author of that?
The author was Chris Fussell.
Yep.
Fussell.
Perfect. Ross also asked why sometimes teams object or put barriers up to new people entering into leadership or roles, given there is so much evidence of diverse thinking, so within an organisation. Why do you believe that some teams object to new people entering into leadership roles, given there is evidence around the diverse thinking?
Well, I do think it has to do with how we are as humans, right? Everything that's new is like primarily scary. Like, we're afraid of anything that's new. We're creatures of habit, right? I mean, how many of us out there have the same breakfast every single morning? Like here. So if I have to mix it up because whatever, my oatmeal is not here, I already go like, what should I do? Should I eat toast? Should I eat whatever, you know? So I think from that perspective, it's something, if they don't know the context, if they don't know how this can help them, then obviously it will always remain that barrier. And it's just because, again, they're scared of what's coming. And I think the only way how to actually overcome that, you know, if you apply for a certain position, I would hope you get an interview and you get the chance to present something. Then you can make a case of, hey, I understand why you might have objections putting me in charge, you know, or hiring me because I come from a different background. But here is actually how this can help you and why you should actually. So I think it's being open about the fact that you're different, because that means you take away the afraidness in the other people. Because if they know, you know, then they go like, okay, then I can address this issue with him. Yes, it's true. I don't know if you can add value to our organization because you're a soccer guy. You know, in my example, when I transitioned to the Giants, right? I had the luck that I, you know, had leadership there that was really supportive about everything that was different. But otherwise, I think you can easily make a case by actually, again, helping them to understand that you know what they're afraid of. And then you can reverse engineer it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great example. And then also like networks and relationships are important in our industry. When people are looking for positions and looking to move organisations, what pathway do you feel is best? Are internships and those positions still valuable, or is it more about having exposure to different sports, different organisations, and almost giving yourself more diversity in experience and exposure?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Obviously, also a very, very complex question by itself. So let me try to break that down. So I think one thing is any experience you have in life is going to help you for the future. It doesn't matter what it is. You know, if it's going on a vacation, a 3-week trip in Cambodia, right? It will help you to become a better practitioner. And in that regard, I always try to quote Sir Peter Ustinov, several Oscars, you know, British actor or director or author or painter. And that's exactly the point. When he was asked in a talk show 20, 30 years ago, how come he can do all of these things? How is he such a good actor and painter and so on and so forth? He said, like, I am a good actor because I am a good painter. So I think any experience you get, just, you know, take them. Now, that's more from a personal perspective, right? It will help you because you get different perspectives. That was the example I was trying to make with the medical example and the village. And from a more professional perspective, I do believe you always need to know what your, you know, 3-year plan is, what your 5-year plan is, and what you eventually want to achieve, I think. And then you can go like, hey, how does this next step help me to achieve that? So is it helpful to you know, get an internship at an AFL club, as well as an EPL club, as well as a Bundesliga club? For sure. But do you need, again, more of the same? Maybe if all that you want to do is, you know, stay in soccer and reach a certain level, and then you can jump ship from a different angle instead of, because at a certain level, everything is the same, right? If I'm a kit man, and that's no offense against any kit man out there, but it doesn't matter more or less if it's in a soccer scenario, or if it's in a baseball scenario, or if it's in an NHL scenario, and so on and so forth, right? There's a lot of similarities. The same goes, you know, for any strength and conditioning coach, but then there's the few differences. But do you actually have to have this difference in experience in every single position in a different sport? No, most likely not, right? So I think it's good to get these early experiences, like he was alluding to, as, you know, in internships potentially, and then find out, okay, this is the kind of like context I want to work in, and now let me explore that to the maximum, and then I can jump ship again, because then there's nothing I can learn here at that moment, and then I can maximize my experience in the other part, and then come back. But you had enough context there, so there's not a problem of coming back, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. And I think also the organisational structure will sometimes dictate how much exposure or experience you get. Some organisations are not going to have as many people within their performance department. So while job title wise you may seem similar across 2 different sports, if your team is smaller, you're going to get exposure to different components. You may actually have an increase in the decision-making processes and the hierarchy component, as if you were in another performance team where maybe there is a greater volume of staff and you're actually unable to have as much diversity across the program. So when you're talking about looking at opportunities, you may actually have to assess what's the organisational structure and the hierarchy, and how will that assist me in developing different skill sets to progress your career forwards. I think that's exactly it. Like, if you have those, if you know what you want, that's very valuable for each leader as well, like for your superior. Like if I know what your goal is, I can potentially or hopefully help you the best I can in my context or my environment. But if you
just here to watch, I can't necessarily help you because I don't know what it is that you're looking for, right? So I do believe, more proactiveness, and regardless which level you're at, even if you're an intern, that will always help you. Because I think more often than not, superiors are really happy to help you on your way because they're wearing your shoes at some stage as well, right?
Yeah, definitely. What about the case of too much diversity possibly resulting in constant disagreement or unproductive behaviour, and then how that can impact on that psychological safety you spoke about?
Yeah, I think that's more of a philosophical question, I think. Can there ever be too much diversity by itself? Potentially not, but do we have in a certain environment enough time to explore this diversity, right? Because at some stage we still need to be results driven. So the case I was making, with the basketball example, we don't get 30 years until it becomes successful. Like I'm number one, not even there anymore, and so on and so forth. But also, so I think eventually good people will find each other. Doesn't matter how diverse they are, but up until that, it takes time. So from a philosophical perspective, I would say there can't be enough diversity, but if I'm looking to solve a very specific problem, or I need a very specific task to be tackled, then I think it's important to look back at those components. Do I have them on my team already? And do I just need to facilitate their exchange more? Or is it something that I do believe as the superior, manager or leader or director, whatever, right? Or do I believe, no, this is a component that specifically we need for the challenges ahead. We don't have that on our team, so I need to bring somebody else in. So I do think if you drip feed, that's potentially the best way to go about it, instead of like trying to hire 5 new people at the very same time, because then a new hierarchy needs to be built first and foremost, and people need to get to know each other. So I do think if you know what your tasks are, if you know what you're looking for, if you know what you have, then I think you know exactly, then it can be 3 people that you need to hire, regardless how diverse they are, or it may be 0, right? And I think that's the actual question, or the actual problem that needs to be solved, and not the diversity problem by itself. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think the relationships component and the building of trust between your group is really important and powerful. And Michael has asked a question around how do you suggest developing trust within a diverse group, and maybe a group that's just come together, who you spoke about the people and the human component. How best do we go about developing trust within that?
I think that comes down and again to leading by example. It's like if you share, or your Brené Brown, analogy. I think if you share your weak points, if you share your blind spot openly, if you share your mistakes, it's just contagious. Then the next person will do it, and then the next person will do it, and becomes the norm, I do think. So there's a good exercise that I, when was the first time I did that? I think it was, 10 years ago or something. So, and it was about, so I came new to a team, and it was a junior team, a U15 back then. And they didn't know me. It was, so I stepped up and I said, guys, so new season. And very first thing is, I said, like, guys, my biggest fear of the entire season is XYZ. Or my biggest fear regarding you guys is, that you don't listen to me. that I can't teach you anything and that you think it's a waste of time to be with me. So, and I'm not sure if that only works because they're minors, right? But however, it immediately gave them kind of like, okay, he's not a dick. You know, he's kind of like, okay, let's see how he is. Kind of like, at least they gave me the chance to show them, right? So, and I think, and that immediately, if you present yourself on the, on the altar of humiliation, then I think everybody has no other choice than going like, yeah, I can appreciate that, So I don't know. So I try to be as open, but on the other hand, again, you don't know what you don't know. That's the other thing, maybe.
Yeah, and also you have to understand that you can't make everyone happy. And as you showed before, in a team, when we're working with players as well, with diverse cultures, and we're also working in a highly emotional environment where, in AFL, every 7 days you are put under a performance review. You either win or you lose, and then you have to critically analyse what you did wrong, and if you need to review it, and then what injuries occur, how does that impact on so the emotional volatility around making decisions, but then also building relationships and maintaining relationships it can be quite a tricky balance.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, setting the ego aside is obviously one of the hardest, components for all of us. I would say, like, it's certainly for me. Oftentimes, you're like, I wish I would have done this and that, but on the other hand, again, I have an intense way of working myself. People who work with me can back that up. So I know it's tough sometimes.
It's probably a good phrase to use is trying to remove your ego when demonstrating, like you said, your ability to share your fear, your vulnerability, but then also demonstrate your accountability to your mission and your goals. So you've shown this is what I think could be an objective to possibly restricting us from getting to our goal, but this is how I think we can go about achieving it, and just being transparent and open is a really valuable characteristic as a leader, which then will hopefully assist in that diversity component.
Yeah, 100%. And I do think there's only two reasons why somebody doesn't do their job. It's either they're not talented enough, or they're not motivated enough. So, and you need to find out what of those two things it is, and then if the person is not talented enough for a certain job, then find something else for them. And if it's motivation, then find out what motivates them. And that doesn't matter if he's hierarchically right next to you, like same line, or if he's above you or below you, because it's just a matter of, I think it's a very easy equation, if that makes sense. But obviously it's not as easy as it sounds.
That's fantastic insight. What about when we're sharing ideas to try and problem solve? What have you found are the best strategies within your environments? You spoke about the writing down of ideas versus possibly whiteboard sessions versus brain dumping or neural networking. What have you found to be most successful in your environments?
I think it might be because I'm German, I don't know. But I do think a lot of times it begins with the structure by itself. But it's a tiny things to have certain things in order. So what do I mean by that? It's, for example, if the team meets, right, and in a meeting room, then it's important that everybody sits around the table in the same way. If we get, like, if there's only a place for 8 people at the table, but there's 14 people in that meeting, and those the other 6 people need to be behind the first line, if you will, because they literally don't have a space at the table, that already subconsciously puts a layer in between. Well, if I'm sitting back there, you kind of like, nah, I don't have to say anything, type of. So I think it starts with tiny things like that. When it comes down to that structural order. And then I think really what the best thing is I found was that some people are not, and that comes down to psychology, right? And we spoke about that in a different moment, that like those psychology tests and whatnot. So some people are just not comfortable speaking up in front of a group. So what I recommend then is kind of like, hey, if you want to share what you think, do it now, or you have the option of also just writing it to me in an email, but I want your opinion. So there has to be something from you, but I appreciate the fact that you don't feel comfortable enough in like telling it in front of everybody else. So just tell me via email. And I think oftentimes it's that part that we underestimate, that people actually want to say something, but something inside of them, whatever, prevents them from doing it in a certain scenario. And that comes then and again, but then they trust me that I'm not gonna, tell other people in front of the group, whatever, that this is actually an idea that came from that person. So I think that's another component there that I would recommend. Just treat people like they want to be treated and not like you want to be treated. Is kind of like how I try to look at conversations.
Yeah.
And then ultimately, yeah, you cannot do anything but trying to, again, model the behavior. If people are afraid of telling you their opinion, it's because you did something wrong. Like that's 100% on you if they're reporting to you. If they don't tell you what's on their mind, then you're the problem. It's not them. Like there's for me, there's no other explanation.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. In regards to the personality component that you spoke about, do you see value in the personality typing questionnaires and surveys to help build the team cohesion or allow people to understand possibly their personality type and using those types of surveys at all?
I do believe that there's a lot of value in them. And I had the luck to, and her potentially as well, like Maddie Clemens, but we had a long conversation about that as well. And she opened my eyes for that type of evaluation. I do think for an organization, it's important, regardless if it's on the field or off the field, to know about their different types of people they have and what works, because profiling helps to know how everybody is and how everybody potentially then also can improve on. And if you help people to improve themselves, it's always helpful. But obviously the way to do it is, or in my opinion, not to say that it's actually the way to do, it's not the hubris. So I do think it's important that you give people the opportunity to do those tests when they're already in your organization, to find out for themselves where their weak points are, because then it's just facilitated by you, and they don't need to share it with you. But if you hire somebody new, I do believe that it is of value to know who you're bringing in, because you should have a good understanding of who is there already. And again, more of the same, once again, even on a psychological basis, is not necessarily helpful. But I would always give people the option to share that, right? But if you want to work for me, then I would say like, hey, I recommend you to do that test. I would love you to share it with me. You don't have to, but obviously, if you share it, it speaks for you, because I know that you have nothing to hide as well. And there's no right or wrong, right? We all have our flaws. It's nobody has a score of 150 across the board in the EQI.
Yeah,
just not happening.
No, it's a fantastic point you make around using it also to facilitate how you can assist people's development, but then also assist in the understanding of your cohesion between departments and within your team. So I think it's a great point. In regards to the unique tools that people have within, I guess, the context of what they do in their role, do you data and data science is, I guess, a really big component of what we're involved in now. When you start to look at your team diversity, do you start to look at the tools that they have individually and try and shape it around what you feel is necessary for your current objective? Or do you just try and maintain just a constant variety to make sure that no matter what your objective is, you have a balance across your team?
Well, I do try to hire for the blind spots. So trying to see, hey, what is it that the team needs? What don't we have? I do believe that we all need to have a certain level of generalism. So I do think it's important that we know about everything to a certain extent. Excuse me, but there's no way I can know as much as, our sports scientists about coding. And there's also no need to. But do I think that I need to then bring somebody up to that level? No. I mean, it depends on the individual's goals. But on the other hand, also, I'm more a believer of sharpening the sword. So if you're really good at coaching, I do think you're better off in getting even better at coaching, because that's what people will hire you for. And it's a bonus if you can do all the other things to a certain extent because you understand what it's about. So it shouldn't be too weak, obviously. But on the other hand, I do think the more strongly you can, bring out your big talent, the easier it is also for people to know how to use you, if that makes sense, in a nice way, obviously.
No, that's great insights. Max, I'll leave you there, mate. I really appreciate your time today and the presentation. Fantastic start to our leadership series and a really great insight into what I think is an important component to help develop successful teams and organisations. So thanks very much for your time. If people wanted to get in contact with you, is there a best way to get in contact with you?
Yeah, I think just over Twitter or Instagram, whatever, or basically over my email address, which is maxl@soundersfc.com. Just drop me a line if there's questions. I'm always happy to chat.
Perfect.
And obviously it's always an opportunity for me as well to grow and to learn from other people. Like, the more the merrier, to be honest.
Yeah, no, well, it's been fantastic to have you, and congratulations on another successful Seattle Sounders conference. I'm sure everyone's looking forward to an actual face-to-face one, as much as people are enjoying the virtual components. But yeah, it's been a really successful program that Sounders have run for a long time. So I look forward to hopefully getting out to one soon.
Yeah, I hope so too. Yeah, Sean, our head S&C, did a fantastic job of putting that together and arranging everything with our marketing department. It was a huge effort. I know how little he slept to get that all going. So yeah, big kudos to him. Awesome job there, I agree. But obviously, meeting people in person is always a little bit nicer.
Yeah, that's it. Well, enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to chatting to you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Al. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Appreciate it.